Section 5 of Confessions, volumes 5 and 6. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Confessions, volumes 5 and 6, by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Anonymously translated. Section 5. However this might be, Madame de Warrens conceived it necessary to guard me from the perils of youth by treating me as a man. This she immediately set about, but in the most extraordinary manner that any woman in similar circumstances ever devised. I all at once observed that her manner was graver, and her discourse more moral than usual. To the playful gaiety with which she used to intermingle her instructions, suddenly succeeded an uniformity of manner, neither familiar nor severe, but which seemed to prepare me for some explanation. After having vainly racked my brain for the reason of this change, I mentioned it to her. This she had expected, and immediately proposed a walk to our garden the next day. Accordingly we went there the next morning. She had contrived that we should remain alone the whole day, which she employed in preparing me for those favors she meant to bestow, not as another woman would have done, by toying and folly, but by discourses full of sentiment and reason, rather tending to instruct than seduce, and which spoke more to my heart than to my senses. Meantime, however excellent and to the purpose these discourses might be, and though far enough from coldness or melancholy, I did not listen to them with all the attention they merited, nor fix them in my memory as I should have done at any other time. That air of preparation which she had adopted gave me a degree of inquietude. While she spoke, in spite of myself, I was thoughtful and absent, attending less to what she said than curious to know what she aimed at. And no sooner had I comprehended her design, which I could not easily do, than the novelty of the idea, which during all the years I had passed with her had never once entered my imagination, took such entire possession of me that I was no longer capable of minding what she said. I only thought of her, I heard her no longer. Thinking to render young minds attentive to reason by proposing some highly interesting object as the result of it, is an error instructors frequently run into, and one which I have not avoided in my Emile. The young pupil, struck with the object presented to him, is occupied only with that, and leaping lightly over your preliminary discourses, lights at once on the point to which, in his idea, you lead him too tediously. To render him attentive, he must be prevented from seeing the whole of your design, and in this particular Madame de Warrens did not act with sufficient precaution. By a singularity which adhered to her systematic disposition, she took the vain precaution of proposing conditions. But the moment I knew the purchase, I no longer even heard them, but immediately consented to everything. and I doubt whether there is a man on the whole earth who would have been sincere or courageous enough to dispute terms, or one single woman who would have pardoned such a dispute. By a continuation of the same whimsicality, she attached a number of the gravest formalities to the acquisition of her favors, and gave me 8 days to think of them, which I assured her I had no need of, though that assurance was far from a truth. For to complete this assemblage of singularities, I was very glad to have this intermission. So much had the novelty of these ideas struck me, and such disorder did I feel in mine, that it required time to arrange them. It will be supposed that these 8 days appeared to me as many ages. On the contrary, I should have been very glad had the time been lengthened. I find it difficult to describe the state I found myself in. It was a strange chaos of fear and impatience, dreading what I desired, and studying some civil pretext to evade my happiness. Let the warmth of my constitution be remembered, my age, and my heart intoxicated with love. Let my tender attachment to her be supposed, which, far from having diminished, had daily gained additional strength. Let it be considered that I was only happy when with her, that my heart was full, not only of her bounty, of her amiable disposition, but of her shape, of her person, of herself. In a word, conceive me united to her by every affinity that could possibly render her dear. Nor let it be supposed that being 10 or 12 years older than myself, she began to grow an old woman, or was so in my opinion. From the time the first sight of her had made such an impression on me, she had really altered very little, and in my mind not at all. To me she was ever charming, and was still thought so by everyone. She had got something jollier, but had the same fine eyes, the same clear complexion, the same features, the same beautiful light hair, the same gaiety, and even the same voice, whose youthful and silvery sound made so lively an impression on my heart, that even to this day I cannot hear a young woman's voice that is at all harmonious without emotion. It will be seen that in a more advanced age, the bare idea of some trifling favors I had to expect from the person I loved inflamed me so far that I could not support with any degree of patience the time necessary to traverse the short space that separated us. How then, by what miracle, when in the flower of my youth, had I so little impatience for a happiness I had never tasted but in idea? How could I see the moment advancing with more pain than pleasure? Why, instead of transports that should have intoxicated me with their deliciousness, did I experience only fears and repugnance? I have no doubt that if I could have avoided this happiness with any degree of decency, I should have relinquished it with all my heart. I have promised a number of extravagancies in the history of my attachment to her. This certainly is one that no idea could be formed of. The reader, already disgusted, supposes that being in the situation I have before described with Claude Anet, she was already degraded in my opinion by this participation of her favors, and that a sentiment of disesteem weakened those she had before inspired me with. But he is mistaken. 'Tis true that this participation gave me a cruel uneasiness, as well from a very natural sentiment of delicacy as because it appeared unworthy both of her and myself. But as to my sentiments for her, they were still the same, and I can solemnly aver that I never loved her more tenderly than when I felt so little propensity to avail myself of her condescension. I was too well acquainted with the chastity of her heart, and the iciness of her constitution, to suppose a moment that the gratification of the senses had any influence over her. I was well convinced that her only motive was to guard me from dangers, which appeared otherwise inevitable, by this extraordinary favor, which she did not consider in the same light that women usually do, as will presently be explained. The habit of living a long time innocently together, far from weakening the first sentiments I felt for her, had contributed to strengthen them, giving a more lively, a more tender, but at the same time a less sensual turn to my affection. Having ever accustomed myself to call her mamma, as formerly observed, and enjoying the familiarity of a son, it became natural to consider myself as such, and I am inclined to think that this was the true reason of that insensibility with a person I so tenderly loved. For I can perfectly recollect that my emotions on first seeing her, though not more lively, were more voluptuous. At Annecy I was intoxicated; at Chambéry I possessed my reason. I always loved her as passionately as possible, but I now loved her more for herself, and less on my own account; or at least I rather sought for happiness than pleasure in her company. She was more to me than a sister, a mother, a friend, or even than a mistress, and for this very reason she was not a mistress. In a word, I loved her too much to desire her. This day, more dreaded than hoped for, at length arrived. I have before observed that I promised everything that was required of me, and I kept my word. My heart confirmed my engagements without desiring the fruits, though at length I obtained them. Was I happy? No. I felt I know not what invincible sadness which empoisoned my happiness. It seemed that I had committed an incest, and 2 or 3 times, pressing her eagerly in my arms, I deluged her bosom with my tears. On her part, as she had never sought pleasure, she had not the stings of remorse. I repeat it, all her failings were the effect of her errors, never of her passions. She was well born, her heart was pure, her manners noble, her desires regular and virtuous, her taste delicate. She seemed formed for that elegant purity of manners which she ever loved, but never practiced, because instead of listening to the dictates of her heart, she followed those of her reason, which led her astray. For when once corrupted by false principles, it will ever run counter to its natural sentiments. Unhappily, she piqued herself on philosophy, and the morals she drew from thence clouded the genuine purity of her heart. Monsieur Tavel, her first lover, was also her instructor in this philosophy, and the principles he instilled into her mind were such as tended to seduce her. Finding her cold and impregnable on the side of her passions, and firmly attached to her husband and her duty, he attacked her by sophisms, endeavoring to prove that the list of duties she thought so sacred was but a sort of catechism fit only for children, that the kind of infidelity she thought so terrible was in itself absolutely indifferent, that all the morality of conjugal faith consisted in opinion, the contentment of husbands being the only reasonable rule of duty in wives. Consequently, that concealed infidelities, doing no injury, could be no crime. In a word, he persuaded her that the sin consisted only in the scandal, that woman being really virtuous who took care to appear so. Thus the deceiver obtained his end in the subverting the reason of a girl, whose heart he found it impossible to corrupt, and received his punishment in a devouring jealousy, being persuaded she would treat him as he had prevailed on her to treat her husband. I don't know whether he was mistaken in this respect. The minister Perret passed for his successor. All I know is that the coldness of temperament, which it might have been supposed would have kept her from embracing this system, in the end prevented her from renouncing it. She could not conceive how so much importance should be given to what seemed to have none for her, nor could she honor with the name of virtue an abstinence which would have cost her little. She did not, therefore, give in to this false principle on her own account, but for the sake of others, and that from another maxim almost as false as the former, but more consonant to the generosity of her disposition. She was persuaded that nothing could attach a man so truly to any woman as an unbounded freedom, and though she was only susceptible of friendship, this friendship was so tender that she made use of every means which depended on her to secure the objects of it, and, which is very extraordinary, almost always succeeded. For she was so truly amiable, that an increase of intimacy was sure to discover additional reasons to love and respect her. Another thing worthy of remark is that after her first folly, she only favored the unfortunate. Lovers in a more brilliant station lost their labor with her, but the man who at first attracted her pity must have possessed very few good qualities if in the end he did not obtain her affection. Even when she made an unworthy choice, far from proceeding from base inclinations, which were strangers to her noble heart, it was the effect of a disposition too generous, humane, compassionate, and sensible, which she did not always govern with sufficient discernment. End of Section 5. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey.